The engineers stood in silence, staring at something that shouldn't have been possible. 16 four-engine bombers, completed, in a single day, not prototypes, not experimental units, finished aircraft, fueled, armed, ready for combat. April 30, 1944. Boeing Plant 2, Seattle, Washington. 12 German aeronautical engineers, prisoners of war, had been brought to witness American industrial production. They had come expecting to see propaganda. They had designed the Luftwaffe's finest bombers. They understood aircraft manufacturing. They knew what was achievable. What they saw that day would redefine their understanding of impossibility. But that realization would come slowly, and only after everything they believed about industrial warfare had been quietly dismantled. In 1940, German aircraft production was the envy of Europe. The Luftwaffe's bombers had been designed by some of the finest engineering minds on the continent. Each aircraft represented months of precision craftsmanship. German factories produced complex, sophisticated machines built to exacting standards, quality over quantity, engineering excellence over crude mass production. This was the German industrial philosophy, and it had worked. For years, it had worked brilliantly. When war broke out, Germany's aircraft production was methodical, efficient, and proven. Engineers designed, craftsmen built. Each bomber was a testament to technical superiority. The Americans, by contrast, were automotive manufacturers. They built cars, simple machines for simple people. The idea that Ford or Boeing could produce military aircraft on an automotive assembly line was, to German engineers, fundamentally absurd. Aircraft weren't cars. They required precision, complexity, skilled labor that took years to develop. When Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, German military planners were confident. America had industrial capacity, certainly, but they built consumer goods, refrigerators, automobiles, not weapons of war. Albert Speer, who would later become Minister of Armaments, had reviewed intelligence estimates of American production capability. The numbers seemed impressive on paper, but converting automotive factories to aircraft production, at scale, at speed, it defied everything German industry understood about manufacturing, and so they waited, certain that American production would falter under the weight of its own ambition. Yet this certainty would prove fragile. The first B-17 Flying Fortress bombers arrived over Europe in August 1942. German pilots engaged them with confidence. The bombers were well built, certainly, but they came in modest numbers, easily manageable. Losses were acceptable. Then the numbers began to change. Not dramatically, not overnight, but month by month the formations grew larger. Where there had been dozens, there were now hundreds. Where losses would once have reduced American capability for weeks, replacement aircraft appeared within days. German intelligence officers studied the patterns. They calculated American factory output based on observed aircraft. Their estimates were methodical, conservative, grounded in what German industry could achieve. In 1943, they estimated America was producing perhaps 2 to 3 B-17s per day across all facilities. This was already concerning. This pace exceeded German production of comparable bombers, but it was believable. It fit within known parameters of industrial capability. What they didn't yet understand was that their entire framework for understanding production was obsolete. The bombers kept coming. After a raid, Luftwaffe pilots would report destroying dozens of B-17s. Intelligence officers would note the losses. They would calculate the time required to replace such numbers based on their estimates of American production capacity. Then, days later, the bombers would return in even greater strength. The calculations stopped making sense. German factories were working at maximum capacity. Labor shortages were chronic. Raw materials were increasingly scarce. Yet despite these limitations, Germany was still producing sophisticated, high-quality aircraft. If Germany, with its engineering expertise and industrial tradition, was struggling to maintain output, how were the Americans accelerating theirs? The intelligence estimates were revised. Perhaps America was producing 4 bombers per day, perhaps 5. The numbers were adjusted upward reluctantly as combat observations demanded. But even these revised estimates couldn't explain what was being witnessed in the skies over Germany. There was something else, something the intelligence reports couldn't capture, a systematic capacity that went beyond mere production numbers. When a German bomber was destroyed, replacing it meant navigating a complex system, parts from multiple suppliers, skilled workers who had trained for years, quality inspections that took days. Each aircraft was built individually, moving through specialized stations where craftsmen completed their portion of the work. This was the only model German engineers understood. It was how you built aircraft. There was no other way. But American bombers weren't being built that way. They were being manufactured. The distinction was subtle but absolute. At Boeing's Seattle facility, 4 assembly lines ran simultaneously. Not 4 stations where aircraft moved between specialized workers, but 4 complete lines, each producing finished bombers in parallel. The aircraft moved. The workers stayed in position. This was the critical inversion that German industry had never achieved. In German factories, the bomber remained stationary while workers moved around it, each performing their specialized task. It was inefficient, but it was the only way to maintain the precision that German engineering demanded. In American factories, the bomber moved through stations. Workers repeated the same task hundreds of times. The work was simplified, standardized, perfected through repetition. The loss of individual craftsmanship was deliberate. Assembly line production sacrificed artistry for speed. Each worker performed a single task, over and over, becoming extraordinarily proficient at that one operation. And the bombers rolled out in numbers that German craftsmen simply couldn't comprehend. In early 1944, intelligence estimates suggested America might be producing 8 B-17s per day. This figure was considered alarming. It represented production that Germany could not match even at theoretical maximum capacity. But it was still wrong, catastrophically wrong. On that day in April 1944, when German engineers stood in Boeing's Seattle facility, they watched 16 B-17s completed in a single 24-hour period. Not 8. 16. From a single factory. The engineers stood silent because words had become inadequate. They had been brought here to observe American industrial methods, to provide intelligence that might help Germany adapt its own production systems. But what they witnessed wasn't an industrial method. It was an industrial philosophy so fundamentally different from their own that adaptation was impossible. One of the engineers, a senior designer who had worked on the Heinkel He-111 bomber, was reported to have said simply, "We cannot win." Not because German aircraft were inferior, not because German pilots lacked courage, but because the war had never been about aircraft quality or pilot skill. It had been about mathematics, and the mathematics were indifferent to craftsmanship. 16 bombers per day from Seattle, and Boeing had multiple facilities. Across America, other factories were producing their own bombers at similar rates. Ford's Willow Run plant was manufacturing B-24 Liberators. At peak production in 1944, Willow Run completed 1 B-24 every 63 minutes. Not every day, every hour. The German engineers had come to Seattle expecting to see mass production. They had expected assembly lines, perhaps some efficiency improvements over traditional German methods. What they witnessed was industrial warfare at a scale that rendered traditional manufacturing obsolete. America wasn't building bombers. It was manufacturing victory, 1 aircraft every 90 minutes, 24 hours a day, in facilities scattered across a continent that no German bomber could reach. The numbers told a story of inevitability. By April 1944, Boeing's Seattle plant alone was producing nearly 500 B-17s per month. Across all American manufacturers, B-17 and B-24 production combined exceeded 1,200 bombers monthly. Germany's entire heavy bomber production for 1944 would total fewer aircraft than America produced in any given month. And this disparity existed across every category of war material: tanks, trucks, artillery, rifles, ammunition. The pattern was identical. American factories converted to wartime production with a completeness that Germany never achieved. The German engineers understood this intellectually, but standing in that Boeing facility, watching bombers roll off assembly lines at intervals measured in hours, the intellectual understanding became something else: certainty of defeat. Yet even this realization came with a question that none of the engineers could answer. Why hadn't Germany known? Why couldn't Germany have done this? The answer lay not in engineering capability or industrial capacity. Germany had both. German engineers were among the finest in the world. German factories were sophisticated and productive. The limitation was philosophical and structural. German industry had developed in a different tradition: craftsmanship, precision, individual excellence. These were values embedded in German manufacturing culture for generations. American industry had developed differently: interchangeable parts, assembly line efficiency, standardization over customization. These principles had been refined over decades in automotive manufacturing. When war came, each nation applied its industrial philosophy to weapons production. Germany produced sophisticated, high-quality weapons in limited quantities. Each tank, each aircraft, each artillery piece was built to exacting standards by skilled workers. America produced simpler, more reliable weapons in overwhelming quantities. The individual quality might be lower, but the volume was unstoppable. There was no single decision point where Germany could have pivoted to American methods. The entire industrial culture would have needed to be rebuilt from first principles. And by the time the necessity became apparent, time had run out. In 1941, Germany had nearly 140,000 hours of labor in each B-17 equivalent bomber. By 1944, through iterative improvements, this had been reduced to approximately 20,000 hours. This was a remarkable achievement, a seven-fold increase in efficiency. But America had started at 140,000 hours in 1941 and reduced it to fewer than 20,000 hours by 1944. The same seven-fold improvement, but applied to a production system already designed for mass manufacturing. The starting positions were identical. The improvements were parallel, but the underlying systems were incompatible, and in total war the system mattered more than the product. World War II is remembered for battles: Stalingrad, Normandy, the Bulge, Midway. These were the dramatic moments, the visible turning points where courage and strategy determined immediate outcomes. But behind every battle was a production figure. Behind every tank destroyed was a factory that could or couldn't replace it. Behind every bomber shot down was an assembly line that would or wouldn't produce another. The war was decided in factories before it was decided on battlefields. This is the uncomfortable truth that military historians sometimes resist. We want to believe in the decisive general, the brilliant strategy, the heroic stand. And these things mattered. They determined how battles unfolded. But they didn't determine who had the tanks to fight the battles. They didn't determine who had the aircraft to dominate the skies. They didn't determine who had the trucks to move supplies, the rifles to arm soldiers, the ammunition to sustain campaigns. Those questions were answered in Detroit, in Seattle, in Los Angeles and Pittsburgh, and thousands of factories across America that converted from civilian to military production with a completeness that the Axis powers never achieved. The German engineers left Boeing's Seattle facility with detailed reports. They documented what they had seen. They provided recommendations for how Germany might adapt American methods, but their reports were filed away. Because by April 1944, Germany no longer had the time, resources, or industrial foundation to implement systemic change. The war would be decided by production capacity that already existed, not by capacity that might be built. The real question isn't why Germany couldn't match American production. The real question is why it took so long for anyone to realize that industrial capacity would be the deciding factor. When you watch documentaries about World War II, consider not just the battles, but the factories that made those battles possible. Consider not just the generals, but the production planners who determined how many tanks each general would command. The bombers that German engineers watched rolling off assembly lines in Seattle weren't just aircraft. They were the physical manifestation of a different industrial philosophy, one that sacrificed individual craftsmanship for systematic output, one that understood war not as a test of quality, but as a test of mathematics. In total war, the side that can replace its losses faster than its enemy can inflict them will eventually prevail. Everything else is theater. This video is based on historical records, expert analysis, and documented sources. Some interpretations are simplified for storytelling clarity.